Rux. Hi and welcome everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Katie Chkowski. I'm the Special Collections Librarian at the Portsmouth Public Library in New Hampshire. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an Asian American woman with straight black hair. I'm wearing a bluish green scarf with boxes on it and a gray jacket. And I'm here in my office at the library. And also joining us tonight is Nicole Luongo-Cloutier, who is the head of reference in Special Collections. I'd like to begin tonight with our land acknowledgement. The city of Portsmouth is on the homelands of the Abenaki people who have ongoing cultural and spiritual connections to this area. According to tribal oral tradition, Abenaki people have lived in the place now called New Hampshire for more than 12,000 years, since before tribal memory. The Abenaki are part of a larger group of indigenous people who call themselves Wabanaki, or People of the Dawn, and form one of many communities connected by a common language family. Here at the Portsmouth Public Library, we are committed to acknowledging and honoring the human history tied to this land. Tonight's event will last until 8:30, and we plan to be respectful of your time. We have turned on subtitles for greater accessibility. If you'd prefer not to see them, you can toggle them off using the controls at the bottom of your Zoom window. And as I just said, we are recording today's event, and that video will be available on our YouTube channel in a few days. You're welcome to leave your video on, or you can turn it off, but we ask that you keep yourselves muted during the talk. And if you have any questions during the talk, you can put those into the chat and I'll ask them to Sandra at the end of her presentation, or you can save your questions until the end and ask them out loud. Tonight's event is part of our local history series. We host these monthly, and the next one is going to be on Tuesday, March 22nd, also at 7 p.m. And we'll be hosting Nurse Shoup of the Black Heritage Trail, who will talk about the history of green books on the seacoast. And that event will require registration. It's not yet in our calendar, but keep an eye on the calendar because it will be appearing in the next few days, I believe. And we love hearing from you about what you'd like to see at the library. So I'll share an online event feedback form in the chat. And if you fill it out, you'll help the library and you'll be entered to win a library book bag. And this contest is only open to those who can visit the library and pick up the prize. So let me introduce tonight's speaker to you. Sandra Rux received a BA in history from the University of Connecticut and an MA in history from Trinity College in Hartford. She's a graduate of the Museum Studies program of the Munson Institute, Mystic Seaport Museum. And after a business career with AT&T in New York, Sandra came to Portsmouth in 2005 as the Synergy Manager for the Portsmouth Historical Society, Warner House, and Wentworth Gardner and Lear houses, before serving as manager and curator for the Portsmouth Historical Society. She went on to become curator of the Warner House Association and chairperson of the Portsmouth Athenaeum Exhibits Committee. Sandra's interests include hand loom weaving, weaving reed makers in the Northeast, and of course, Lieutenant Governor John Wentworth and his 14 children. So with that, Sandra, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm just gonna check and see if it goes. Oh, yeah, okay. I'm just testing it again. All right, so thank you all for coming to listen. The Zoom format means that on this rainy, horrible night, I can stay in my nice, comfy, warm house in Hamden, Connecticut, and not in Portsmouth. I'm going to talk about the house built for Lieutenant Governor John Wentworth and lived in by some of his descendants. This research was part of preparation for an exhibit at the Portsmouth Athenaeum for it was called the Wentworth Takeover. It's about how the Wentworth family, John and his 14 children, came to dominate life in Portsmouth. However, because of COVID and because I moved to Connecticut, the exhibit didn't happen yet. There's some possibility it may yet happen in 2023. If I can get my head together to do a remote kind of exhibit. But so with the house, first of all, I want to thank people who helped with this. Tom Hardiman and Robin Silva at the Portsmouth Athenaeum have been encouraging and have dug out different things for me and doing research remotely here. John Schnitzler lent me copies of photos of the house being dismantled from historic New England that he has at Strawberry Bank. Jim Garvin and Richard Candy for their early research about the house, and the Metropolitan Museum for saving the house parts and making the house better known, and to the Portsmouth Library for inviting me to speak. So the house was built in the late 17th century, and Governor John Wentworth lived there until he died in 1730. And then his widow, Sarah Hunking Wentworth, was there. And then it just sort of, no mention of who was living there until Brewster in the 1850s writes how old it is and that the Vaughan family had lived there for 20 years. And he's writing the 1850s, and the Purcell sisters before them. Well, that's certainly a clue, because the Purcell sisters are descended from Lieutenant Governor John Wentworth. So that's kind of where I started. And we will go, first of all, this is Lieutenant Governor John Wentworth. Probably not a great rendition of him. It was done by Blackburn. So it's a nice painting, but it was done in 1759. And John Wentworth, Lieutenant Governor John Wentworth, died in 1730. So it's definitely a posthumous painting. And it was commissioned by Benning Wentworth to be in his the Wentworth, what's now the Wentworth Coolidge Mansion. So, and it's so we'd have to take it with a grain of salt as to how he really looked. There is another drawing of him that I did not have an image of. All right, so this is the good stuff of the what it looks like now at the Metropolitan Museum. It's on the 3rd floor of the American wing. And should you be wanting to go and see it in person, I recommend making an appointment. Because the first time I went to see it, I had to talk my way in through the security guards, who then, because they had it wasn't open, it was off limits. So the second time I went, I made an appointment with the curatorial staff and got to spend more time in the room. But this is the parlor on, it's actually not the parlor, they call it the parlor. It's the 2nd floor room that came, all of the woodwork that came from the Wentworth House. And the stairway, which was possibly the most magnificent early stairway in Portsmouth, although we say that because it is the only one of the early stairways that we have. There were some other grandish houses in Portsmouth that didn't survive. Richard Wyberd had a brick house built in the first decade of the 18th century, and Samuel Penhallow had a brick house that burned in the fire of 1813 that the Sherburne family had lived in. So there may have been other survivors, but these are the ones that survive, and they're kind of unique with their spirals. The we go on. Here is the house. This picture is the late 19th century photograph, and you can see it's not looking too great. And the fence comes right up to the front door. And reading the deeds from this period, the property does divide that way. The line of the neighboring property goes right to the front door, because it's the end of Manning Street, of what was Manning Street at that time. Manning Street now ends up by Gates and doesn't come all the way down. This location, we will go to the map in a minute, but it's like in the middle of the Strawberry Bank parking lot, basically. And we see it's a kind of a relatively conventional, fairly large 18th century house, although it's not symmetrical like a Georgian house, because one side has 2 windows on 1st and 2nd story, and the other side only has 1. And this is the house in 1907. And these photographs, this is a stereo view that's in the collection of Historic New England. This the side windows are a little bit unusual. More usually they would be more together, but this is because it's one long room, and this is how the fenestration ended up. The attic obviously was usable space, and the very small attic windows survived, whereas the other windows had been updated along the way. And you can see the house, you can see how the fence comes up to the porch here in this, at this angle. Also that the fence has suffered a bit since the first postcard. This house, this postcard, this view, it claims to be the birthplace of Benny Wentworth, which is the usual claim here, and the oldest house in Portsmouth, except for the Jackson House. And that's kind of a big maybe, because the Sherburne House was built around the same time. So for surviving houses, questionable. And plus this one doesn't really survive anymore. All right, and this is 1926. This is the year it was taken down. And you can see that some improvements have been made. The porch and, but some other buildings have been built, encroaching on it. So it was still in dire shape. And so it was taken apart in 1926. And this is a map showing you where it is. I think my cursor works here. This is the house right here. My little blue arrow doesn't show up very well. That's the house. This is what this street labeled. This is the 1813 map. This labeled Wentworth Lane is Manning Street. And you can see how Manning Street goes all the way basically to the end here. And this street over here on the bigger map, you can see this street is Dock Lane, which is now Hancock Street. And this whole area in my larger cutout is what was known as Pickering Neck. It went from the Cove, which is Puddle Dock, to the South Mill Pond. John Pickering was a miller, and he was down here at the bottom by the South Mill Pond, but he owned all of Pickering Neck. He was, Pickerings were one of the early families to come to Portsmouth in the 1630s. And so they had, this was their share of the land. The Cutt family was on the other side of the dock largely, and across up through Daniel Street and beyond. Okay, so Lieutenant Governor John Wentworth, who was he and how did he get started as a prominent person in Portsmouth? He was the son of Samuel Wentworth, who is supposedly the first child born in Dover, or maybe his parents, that's where his father, William Wentworth, lived. Samuel was born in 1640. And he was, his wife was Mary Benning, who was came from England, was not born here. And they were both born, John was born in 1673 in Portsmouth. His father had kept a tavern in Newcastle and then moved to Portsmouth and opened a tavern in Portsmouth and had permission to do that. So some people have said that this was quite a while ago that people said this. And in the write-up for the Met on this building, it basically says that the house dates from 1671 when Samuel Wentworth moved to Portsmouth. And architectural historians since have said, no, that's not true. And if you Samuel bought property from Bridget and Thomas Daniels and from Edward Cranfield. This property included 2 houses, one where he lived and another where his son Samuel lived. And both of these houses are on the south side, the north side of the cove. So they're not where the Lieutenant Governor John Wentworth House is. They're on the other side where the main part of Strawberry Bank is where these houses are. And one of the houses was left to the widow, to Mary Benning, and to for her life use, and the other one to the son Samuel. And Mary Benning remarried quickly, and she sold that one to one of her daughters and son-in-law, the one that she lived in. So Samuel died of smallpox in 1690. There was an outbreak of smallpox in Portsmouth at that time. It had come from, had been an attempted invasion of Quebec, and it was thought that the smallpox was brought back on the ships from that to Boston and then came up to Portsmouth. Samuel died in May, but Daniel, one of his sons, died in April, and Samuel's wife Hannah died the month before that. And so the family had significant loss. Samuel very quickly moved to Boston and continued working, developed a trade as a merchant there, leaving John pretty much the leader of the family in Portsmouth. So Mary Benning, the widow, after she sold her house to her daughter and son-in-law, she remarried to Richard Martin, and she was Richard Martin's 4th wife, and she survived him. And he left her in his, one of the interesting things he left her in his will was the set of valances that she had embroidered while she was married to him. So kind of him. And when Mary died, she specified this funeral that had 6 neighboring clergymen to carry her coffin into the church, and to have, they got the typical scarves and rings and so forth, the whole bit. And there was the funeral sermon was sponsored by her son John and was published. So Mary was no shrinking violet. So what did John Wentworth do before he became lieutenant governor? He had to have done something besides be the tavern keeper's son. So after the death of his father, he's referred to as a mariner and a master, which meant he went to sea. He started out as crew on a ship and became master of a vessel. And he built up income that way, and he started buying land. And he was very astute with his money. Some of the Wentworths were less astute. He bought some of his brother Samuel's property, and he invested in land in Portsmouth, particularly in the Plains area. He owned quite a few acres up there, hundreds of acres in the Plains area. And there's no evidence of early land purchase on Pickering's Neck where the house is located. He did own land on Pickering's Neck, but it was a little bit later than when it's thought that the house was built. He became a member of the King's Council in 1712, and then was appointed a justice of the Court of Common Pleas. So he's moving up in the world here. And then he was appointed the lieutenant governor. And when he first got appointed lieutenant governors didn't do a lot. They didn't have a lot of power. They reported to the governor who was in Massachusetts. But then Governor Shute was recalled, and actually I think Governor Shute died. Anyway, so John Wentworth had to sort of step in, and he had to actually govern, at which he did successfully. The so back to John and the house, because we aren't really pursuing his whole career here. He married Sarah Hunking, 1693, and Sarah was the only surviving child of Mark Hunking. There probably had been other children in the family, and her mother was Sarah Sherburne, who was one of the younger daughters of Henry Sherburne and Rebecca Gibbons, who owned, if you're at all familiar with Portsmouth history, the Sherburne family features quite prominently in it. And Rebecca Gibbons was the daughter of Ambrose, who was the owner of the Great House in Strawberry Bank. And that's how the that family ended up with land there with the Great House type that was left to one of the grandsons. So Mark Hunking himself was a shipbuilder, a merchant, and a member of the King's Council. When he died in 1728, he was the oldest surviving member of the King's Council. So he was kind of the old experienced member. He was, the Wentworth genealogy, which is very useful in many ways, it had trouble with figuring out which Mark Hunking was the Mark Hunking that was the father of Sarah. But when you look at records, which the genealogists probably didn't have access to all of these records that you can now search online, it becomes pretty clear which Mark Hunking he is. He was a son of Mark Hunking, and his father was the one who started gathering land purchases in the Portsmouth area. He also had brothers who lived in Exeter, Dover, Newington, not Newington, Newmarket. And so there were other Hunkings about, and they tended to repeat the names over and over. Each family did that. So Mark Hunking had inherited some Sherburne land, and he also purchased many parcels of land, and he inherited land from his father, and he purchased many parcels of land. For many years, he was at Little Harbor, land that later became what we now know as the Wentworth Village Mansion. And he did purchase a lot fitting the description of the location of John Wentworth's house from John Pickering in 1694. It's the description of the lot, essentially, it's because it was at the beginning of when John Pickering was dividing the land on Pickering's Neck. It starts with sticks and stones marking the boundaries, which is a little hard to decipher where it might be. But these sticks and stones, that's a place where Samuel Wentworth had built a vessel. Now, we don't know if was this Samuel Wentworth who died in 1690, or was it Samuel Wentworth, the son? But it's where they built a vessel. And so it's at the edge of the what they called the Cove, which later became Pebble Dock. And the only way I was able to sort of fit it in was to read all the adjoining descriptions of John Pickering's sales. So eventually you get people on the east and on the west, so you can fit that lot into where the house is now. And later on, people describe Joshua Pierce had a house, and he's transferring it to his son Daniel, and he describes it as being next to Lieutenant Governor John Wentworth's mansion. And a bit later, when that property is transferred again, it's described as being next to John Wentworth Esquire, who was one of the sons of Lieutenant Governor John. And on the other side, we have the Marshalls, and who had gotten their land from Moses Paul. Moses Paul was described himself as a carver, And he, we know that he was involved in building the Joshua Pierce's new house, which is up by the meeting house, which is now the wardroom, the south end. And there was a deed from Moses Paul's widow, Mary, who is not living near the Lieutenant Governor John Wentworth house, but living up closer to the meeting house on a lot that Moses Paul had. And she talks about how he built the Joshua Pierce's new house. This is about 1730. So, you know, there's a lot of, one would say lots of land record trivia that you come across in trying to prove one location. And I have to say that I still did not do every lot around that area. But so Sarah Hunking Wentworth inherited the whole fortune of her father after her mother's dower. Her father died in 1728 and her mother in 1740. And in the land record, she does appear as selling off various parts of that had belonged to her father. She's also, and she appears to be very capable in widowhood as well, dealing with John Wentworth's property. So John Wentworth got property in Portsmouth through his father-in-law and his wife. He bought a lot of property himself in the outskirts of town. So he's doing sort of the best of both worlds. All right, John and Sarah had 14 children who were all going to be sort of the part of my exhibit here. But all of these children lived to adulthood. And having 14 children in the early 18th century is not particularly rare. Having all of them live to adulthood was rare. So they, and so when you look at, okay, this house has basically 6 rooms. 2 of them are very large rooms. The one that's at the Met and the room below that are very large rooms. The so you have on the first floor, you have a keeping room in the hall. This is from John Wentworth Esquire's will, his descriptions. And you have, and the entry and the kitchen. On the second floor, you have the chamber above the hall, the chamber above the keeping room, and the back room. So you essentially, and assuming all of them were chambers, all of the upstairs were chambers in John Wentworth's time, which is not always the case. It could have been he used one of the rooms for ceremonial governor things, but certainly with all these children did need them. And they also, the garret up, it looks like it would be quite good for sleeping children and servants. So the children, most of them are familiar, some of them familiar names: Benning, Hunking, Sarah, Mark Hunking are probably the best known. And they all, they all outlived their mother as well, except for Rebecca, who died in the late 1730s. All right, so Lieutenant Governor John died in 1730. And I think people knew that he had been ill, because Benning wrote to John Pierce Benning was off in London. And he wrote that when he had left his father, he was on the mend. And then he suddenly gets the news that he's dead. So Benning is surprised. Also, the other things, Benning expected to be appointed as the next lieutenant governor, but that didn't happen. So John, in his will, left the estate to Sarah with provision that she allocate the estate to the children. So Benning, as the eldest, was going to get $2,000 in real estate and land in Casco Bay. John, who was the third son, was getting $1,000 in real estate and land in Casco Bay. Hunking had already received land in Portsmouth, and it seems to have been kind of left out of the will in one copy of it, but later on they kind of restored him. And then everybody else got $1,000 in real estate. And the portions for Hannah Plaisted and Elizabeth Loud were to be doled out as income to them. Why, might you ask? Hannah Plaisted was, her husband Samuel Plaisted was essentially a drunk. And it was thought that he would waste away her inheritance. So she was only going to get income. Well, he died fairly soon thereafter. And she married Theodore Atkinson, who had plenty of money and made plenty more. So she was kind of freed from that. However, Elizabeth Loud continued to be on the doled out income scheme for her, basically the rest of her life. And it's all because of Elizabeth Loud that the estate did not get totally probated until like the 1780s. And what might Elizabeth Loud have done that she was not trusted with the money? Well, it appears that John Loud, who was her husband, the Loud family were basically shoemakers. So it's possible just that they didn't have any money, and the Wentworths didn't trust them to preserve the inheritance. They probably had opposed Elizabeth's marriage, and were, because in searching the records, can't find anything that Elizabeth was ill. And as it turns out, Elizabeth was the last of the surviving 14 children. And she had John Loud, and then she was married to Benjamin Underwood, according to the Wentworth genealogy. So she seemed perfectly capable. So it seemed that her husband Loud was deemed insufficient. All right, Sarah kept conveying various pieces to the children through the 1730s and up until her death in 1741, because some of the children were still minors when John had died in 1730. And it appears that Sarah lived in the house until her death. And then her will reserves the estate, her estate, for the support of the daughter, Elizabeth Loud. And that meant that left in her estate, she had conveyed out all the land to the children. And the house and land and personal effects were still left. And because John had left them to her, they did not convey out of the estate. All right, so now to some of the children. This is our second Sarah. Here, this is Sarah Wentworth Macpheadris Jaffrey. And she married Archibald Macpheadris, who had built this fancy new brick house, which is probably the grandest house in Portsmouth at the time, certainly. And she lived in the Warner House, what is now the Warner House. And she was only not quite 16 when she married Archibald Macpheadris. He quickly went off. He was at sea more than he was home. It's, you would think, given all the siblings she had, perhaps some of them came and stayed at her house, but we don't know that. She had servants. She did have enslaved people as servants. And she had 3 children. One died as a baby, and there are letters back and forth telling, there was at one point in 1720 that report had reached Portsmouth that Archibald Macpheadris had died in Cadiz. And back in Portsmouth, the baby had actually died. So Archibald was advised by his merchant friends to make sure that Sarah knew that he wasn't dead and that he would perhaps head for home, which he eventually did. It took him a few months, but he got there, and they had found out fairly soon that he wasn't dead, but the baby had died. And then she had a son, Gilbert, and a daughter, Mary. And the only one who lived to have children was Mary. So Archibald died in 1728, and leaving Sarah a widow at a very young age. She was born in 1702, so when she was left, I guess he died in 29. And because she was only 27 when she was left a widow, running, basically settling his estate, the debts, which were many, and what actually held up for her in the estate for she and Mary was the land that her father had given her when they married. So she had 300 acres at the Plains that survived all of the settling Archibald's debts. All right, so Sarah apparently lived in the Warner House for 9 years or so as a single person, working on settling the estate. And then she married George Jaffrey, who was quite a bit older than she, and moved to the Jaffrey House, which is the top. The top here is the Jaffrey House, another house that was torn down. It was torn down in 1920, and the Warner House, which is today a museum. So Sarah spent her juvenile years at the Lieutenant Governor John Wentworth House, and then she moved on to bigger and better houses. So the interesting thing about Sarah is that when Jonathan Warner married her daughter Mary, and they took over the house, and Sarah, who was a widow again, decided to stay at the Jaffrey House, and she basically kept house for George Jaffrey's son, until she died, essentially, in 1776. She was probably about a decade and a half older than Jaffrey's son. So it was an interesting situation, probably. And then we have the third son, John Wentworth. I'm not covering Benning at all because he became governor, and he lived eventually at Wentworth Coolidge, although he did rent the Warner House for a while and lived there for a number of years. So the third son, and Hunking, I must mention Hunking. Hunking had his own house across from North Church. Most of the Wentworths were originally South Church people. Sarah was devoted to South Church, and the new South Church, which is where the wardroom is now, you could easily walk to from her house. The later generation became Anglicans, went to Queen's Chapel, and Hunking Wentworth had his house across from North Church, and he was a stalwart member of North Church. And he also was a patriot, whereas the others were not. If they were still living, they were not. So John Wentworth, he's sometimes known as Major John Wentworth or John Wentworth Esquire, because he was a judge. And he married Sarah Hall. He graduated from Harvard in 1723, might have stayed in Boston for a few years, and probably came back to Portsmouth at the time of his father's death. He never owns any other land in Portsmouth, so there isn't any indication he lived anywhere except his father's house. So he came and lived there. He married Sarah Hall in Boston in 1732, shortly after her father's death. And then he lived essentially between 1732 and when he was appointed to the Court of Common Pleas. He seems to have lived on his property and her money. And because he wasn't a merchant, he wasn't going off to sea, and he seems to have been content to do that. And he was appointed judge of the Court of Common Pleas in 1754 and the judge of probate in 1765. And both of these would have generated some income. Actually, could have generated considerable income. So our third Sarah, who lived in the house, and she probably lived there for longer than any of the others. She was Sarah Hall, and she was a daughter of Hugh Hall and his second wife, Mary, from Barbados. She was born in Barbados, lived her early years there. She had a much older half-brother, Hugh Hall, who was a well-known merchant in Boston. And he brought his brother Richard and Sarah to Boston for education. Sarah was supposed to learn dancing and polite speech and sewing and that sort of, to be a well brought up young lady. And in her father died in 1732. She was left 3,000 pounds and 2 slaves. While it's certainly not documented that the early Wentworth family had enslaved people. Certainly Archibald Macpheadris and his family did. And later, many of the children had families that had 1 or 2 enslaved people. Sarah came from a whole different situation in that her family had sugar plantations and they had hundreds of slaves at various times. And they also were merchants. And I think that they eventually gave up most of the plantationing and were concentrated as merchants. But the situation in Barbados was certainly different. Barbados in 1676 had 50,000 white people and 80,000 Negro people. In 1755, they had between 25 and 30,000 white people, and they still had and they listed as 80,000 slaves. In 1676, they were called Negroes. Most were slaves, and they had the number stayed the same because Barbados was for a time in the business of exporting slaves as well. Now, in this contrast with 1640, Richard Cutt, who came to Portsmouth, left Barbados for New Hampshire. There were only 65 Negroes on the whole island. And because he was involved in cotton production, cotton market failed in 1640, having to do with India and imported cotton from there. And but then the Barbados planters learned sugar production, and sugar production required lots of slaves. So they had many enslaved people in Barbados starting about 1660. And you can see by 1676, it had grown to 80,000. So that is a huge number. So that meant Sarah grew up in a very different atmosphere. But she did spend probably most of her teenage years in Boston with her grandmother, Lydia, whose name was Coleman at the time. Lydia was on her 3rd husband. And Coleman was a reverend. So she spent sort of part of her youth in a congregational household. So Sarah and John had 4 children in the house. Hugh Hall, who was born in 1732 or 33, Mary in 1740, and Sarah in 41, and Rebecca in 47. So this is a little bit about Hugh Hall. It was Hugh Hall III, actually, but in Boston, he was called Hugh Hall Jr. And he lived with he came and lived with his grandmother, went to Harvard, and he then lived and worked in Boston with his business tied to Barbados and the trade in sugar, rum, and slaves. And so Hugh Hall Wentworth developed his island connections through his uncle, Hugh Hall. And this is Hugh Hall Wentworth. And he lived in Portsmouth early in his life, but he was involved in developing a trading network from a really young age. He then married Penelope Jepson of Newport, Rhode Island in 1758. And they had children, Richard, Elizabeth, Anne. And they had another son, Jack, that Hugh mourns in a letter. And Penelope died in 1771 in Portsmouth, and mentions that her babe had died also, the obituary. So Hugh was gone a lot. And in their letters that he wrote to different people in Portsmouth, there's quite a number of letters to Jonathan Warner. He writes in 1766, I believe, he goes to Ireland and to England, and he is traveling about, and he's like just overcome with how wonderful the place is. Most of it. He is hoping to see the newly appointed Governor Wentworth, John, who was his cousin. And he talks about how much he misses Penelope and his family. Given how much he was gone, it's questionable. Or it's a case of the heart, absence makes the heart grow fonder. And he came back to Portsmouth and he sold everything in Portsmouth. So the chunk of his father had sold him land on Pickering's Neck, and he sold that to Gregory Purcell, who was his brother-in-law. He moved to a plantation of 479 acres and 172 enslaved people in Grenada. And he operated his merchant business and the plantation in Grenada. And he was appointed Lieutenant Governor of Grenada and the islands surrounding in 1771. But he died in 1774, still as a young man. So Hugh Hall is dead, Penelope is dead. The children are still in Portsmouth. And we do not know Richard Hall. The Wentworth genealogy says Richard Hall Wentworth died young, but he lived to be at least a teenager. And Elizabeth and Anne married and had children. So John Wentworth Esquire, back to him. He owned several parcels of outlands when he died, which are in other towns like Chester and Haverhill and Stafford. And so he had, but not any land in Portsmouth. He had sold his land in Pickering's Neck to his son, Hugh Hall. In 1753, when he was probably just like 18 to somewhere between 18 and 20. And so he obviously needed money in that time period. We know he owned a still house because several deeds and adjoining properties mention John Wentworth Esquire's still house. We don't know exactly what he distilled in his still house, but he had one. He also was apparently interested in gardening. Samuel Appleton, who was another son-in-law, writes to Hugh Hall Wentworth that he's sending watermelon seeds for his father. So he's experimenting with different plants. His income seemed to be limited to his court earnings and his inheritance in Sarah's money. And one interesting deed that shows how confusing the Wentworths can be is that he had mortgaged part of his Portsmouth property to John Wentworth, gentleman, who was Benning's son, in 1755. His heirs sold it to Governor John Wentworth in 1772. So the deed reads about, and this is like Michael and Martha Wentworth selling it to Governor John Wentworth, and they write about John Wentworth, the property of John Wentworth Esquire was mortgaged to John Wentworth gentleman and is being sold to Governor John Wentworth. So you can see how it can be confusing. He left, in his will, he left his estate to Sarah including what he owned and what would come through reversion. So this has to do with Sarah's estate not finishing up with probate because Elizabeth Loud is still alive and getting her income from Sarah's estate. The interesting thing is about the other, Samuel Wentworth had made Mary one of his executors. Lieutenant Governor John Wentworth made his wife Sarah his executor. Sarah Macpheadris was executor of Archibald's estate. John Esquire did not make his wife Sarah, even though he left the estate to her, he did not make her the executor. The executors were his son, Hugh Hall Wentworth, who was in Grenada, and his sons-in-law, Gregory Purcell and Gilliam Butler. Gregory was married to Sarah and Gilliam was married to Rebecca. And he had his inventory is quite, sort of reveals this lifestyle he had. Most of the furniture he had in the house was kind of old-fashioned. He had cane chairs and he had leather-bottom chairs. He had a couple of pieces in mahogany, a table, but much of his furniture was in maple. But he did have a desk and bookcase, and he had all the pieces you would need for a high-end life at that time, but not, he didn't have the Robert Harold mahogany kind of furniture that was coming, that some of his siblings had. So the other thing that he had in his will, he had 3 very old enslaved people. And it says they're good for almost nothing. The question I have, were these the enslaved people that came with Sarah when she inherited from her father? It's quite likely that at least 2 of them came from Sarah at the time. So he's off with his, and his inventory is the first inventory of the actual in the house, and it lists the rooms and shows that there are 6 of them, which is what the house had. It had more rooms when it was taken apart because partitions had been put in, but essentially it started out with the 6 rooms, and it also shows that it still only had the 6 rooms, no partitions, when he was, and he died in 1772. Actually 73 he died. So he's and leaving Sarah, his widow, in possession of the house. So now we have Sarah Wentworth and Gregory Purcell. Sarah Wentworth is one of the children of John Wentworth, Esquire. She was born in 1741. She grew up in the Lieutenant Governor John Wentworth House that was currently occupied by her father and mother. But she married Gregory Purcell in 1759. She was 18. And Gregory Purcell was in Portsmouth as a ship captain from about 1750. Because when you check the shipping records, he's in and out of Portsmouth from then on. Although he doesn't pay taxes in Portsmouth until 1754, which means he was starting to settle once he started to pay taxes. He bought land and had the house built between 1757 and 58. Hope Still Cheswell, free mulatto, is the probable builder. Gregory owned vessels and a store, although he's no longer listed as master of a vessel after 1756. So he essentially, he retired from active captaining, but he had enough capital to own vessels and parts of vessels, and he had a store. So these are some of his ads. He was in 1750. He was selling Newcastle coal at the Long Wharf. He had a store at the Long Wharf. And then a bit later, he's selling West India rum, sugar, molasses, pork, Irish beef, butter, oatmeal, all sorts of things. And the typical things, nothing really unusual. When you look at where his ships were going, coming from and going, they were going to as close by as the Carolinas, and they also were going, a lot of them, to the islands, to Barbados, and to Antigua, and some just said West Indies. And then when they came back, it would say where they cleared from. So it's where they entered from. They cleared to more generic West Indies and would enter more specifically from an island. There also were several vessels that went to Newfoundland. And basically he was dealing, at least certainly his Portsmouth vessels were smaller vessels. He may have had some vessels that he partly owned that were more in and out of Boston, which was not unusual at the time. We have to sort of go back and forth a bit, but he pretty settled. He was in Portsmouth, and I know at the John Paul Jones house where I worked at one point, it was, part of the story was that Gregory Purcell died probably at sea. Well, all the paper evidence points to him having been in Portsmouth, because he serves as administrator for other people in their wills. He's administrator for his father-in-law's will. He acts on land records as witnesses for different people. So clearly a paper trail exists in Portsmouth, and he has the advertisements for his store. So he clearly is in Portsmouth. And so the will of Gregory, and this is the will of Gregory, and he is, you can see the signature down there, looks kind of ill, I think, but because assuming his business, he probably was a good record keeper. But the will is made the 28th of October in 1776. The witnesses are Mary Clapham and Rebecca Butler, who are sisters of Sarah Purcell. And then the other one is Richard Hall Wentworth, who is the son of Hugh Hall Wentworth, the one who supposedly died young, but he's probably about 16, maybe 17 when he witnesses the will. And one question might have been, after Penelope died, what were some of the children living with the Purcells? And it's possible that he actually lived there. So Gregory Purcell here pretty much dies in his bed. And because this is the 28th of October, the 27th of November, Rebecca Butler and Mary Clapham attest that they saw him sign it. This will is being submitted for probate. At the same time, they say Richard Hall Wentworth is not in town. So he possibly has gone off to enlist with the Loyalists, or he's gone off to the islands, to Grenada, to see if he can claim some of his father's property. That's just sort of supposition. Now, in Sarah Purcell's family, all the rest of the family were Loyalists. We don't know about her mother. Her mother stayed in Portsmouth, but her two sisters, husbands, were instrumental in supporting the Loyalists. John Clapham and Mary they went to New York, and they were in Philadelphia for a while, and then they went to Canada, and they lived in Campobello. Rebecca Butler and her husband Gillam Butler were he went to, he signed on as a logistics person for getting supplies for the British Army. And he was in Philadelphia, and he was in Virginia, and he was involved in getting supplies. There was some question about, was he totally honest with this, but it turned out okay. He was actually quite young because he and Rebecca married in 1770. She was 23 and he was only 19. So by the time war breaks out, he's still only 25 years old. And he basically works with the British Army until the end of the war. And the Rebecca, she's by 1783, he's in Philadelphia at one point, just before and they won't let him come back to Portsmouth. So she petitions to go with him. And she states that she's going to go as soon as she recovers from the smallpox, because she's had the vaccination for smallpox, because she's not going to go to Philadelphia until she's had her vaccination. So then they go to Canada as well, to New Brunswick, and live at Campobello. So they are, so Sarah is pretty much left as the only child in Portsmouth of her mother and deceased father. The estate did not get totally administered, and Sarah petitions the court that she be allowed to do that because of the administrators who were her husband Gregory Purcell and her brother-in-law Gillen Butler were the ones who were doing the work. And she says one is dead and one is banished. And so the court grants her the right, and so she helps finish administering her father's estate to the extent it can be, because it's still having to do with the reversion that's going to come when Elizabeth Loud dies. So Sarah Purcell, as a widow, other than helping to solve her father's estate problem, she has to administer her own estate. She's left with debt and 5 children under 12, and was pregnant with a 6th. Then she is responsible for settling Gregory's estate and her father's. So she has basically no money. She used the asset, except she has a house. She used the house to take in boarders. And this is where John Paul Jones comes in, and why the house is now called the John Paul Jones house. He was a boarder for Sarah. And it's possible that, she relates to John Paul Jones. He has a career similar to her husband Gregory's. Gregory was a master of a ship when he was a teenager, as was Jones. And it was, or John Paul as his real name was. And, so she might actually well have related to his story, but he boarded there while he was waiting for the Ranger to be finished, and then later when the America was being finished. So Sarah decides she's being relatively successful at this business, and in 1783 sells her house to Woodbury Langdon, rents the old Packer property, which was recently, it was Northeast Auctions, although that's a different building. The Packer house burned down in the 1813 fire. This is a survey of the Packer house here before when Greenleaf owned it after the Packers, and had the survey made 1803. There's no image preserved of the house. And this is the house so Sarah then traded locations with William Brewster in 1787. Brewster was running the Bell Tavern on Market Square. She moved there. So she missed out on operating the place where George Washington slept. The other complication being she was dead by the time George Washington came. So she advertises in the paper that she's moved to basically the Bell Tavern, and it's going to be run genteelly on as good a terms as any tavern in America. And that's Sarah. And meanwhile, back at the old mansion, you still have widow Sarah Hall Wentworth, and her sister Mary Hall Wentworth moved in with her when her husband, William Wentworth, died. And they both died in 1790. Mary Hall Wentworth had been married to a Winthrop first, and William Wentworth had been married to Marjorie Pepperell. When their spouses were gone, they married each other and lived in Kittery. So once William died in the late 1760s, Mary moves in to the Lieutenant Governor John Wentworth House with her sister. And the other thing that has happened is that the two of them died within a month of each other. John Hunking Wentworth in 1779 petitioned the court to allow the estate of Sarah Hunking Wentworth to be settled. And he pointed out that only he, brother Mark Hunking, and one sister were left alive. The grandchildren were wanting their inheritance. One of the people complaining about wanting their inheritance was Jonathan Warner, who himself was not a grandchild, but his wife, Mary Macpheadris, was a grandchild. It had only been 48 years since Sarah Hunking Wentworth had died. Oh, excuse me, I think I subtracted wrong, 38 years. 38 years. And the one sister left alive was Elizabeth Loud Underwood. So she was the one that was causing the hang up to begin with. She eventually did die in 1790. So Sarah finally owned the house where she had lived for almost 60 years. And she left it to her daughter, Mary Clapham, who, remember, lives in Canada. So here's the Mary Clapham in 1803 sells the house to the Purcell sisters, Margaret, Anne, Sarah, and Suzanne. She calls her Susanna Purcell of Portsmouth for $30. And she sells the house and the land. So this is the first time that house got sold, and it was built probably between 1695 and 1699. So the Purcell sisters, they are certainly not wealthy, but they make a business for themselves. They are identified as seamstresses, but they also imported goods for a shop, all textile related. So they've got over here bonnets, dress turban, angoulême and dress turbans. It was a style of hat. Trimmings. They also have patterns for dresses, pelisses, spencers. They're all like very Regency style. That was in 1816. And then corsets. Essentially, you sort of get the old style, the newest style of corsets, but they can still make the old ones too. And cord and tassels, flowers and plumes, and satin and silk shoes. I mean, you could really get yourself dressed up with the stuff from their little shop. So they're in the house, and then Margaret, the eldest, marries Thomas Manning in 1808. Manning is decades older than she is, and that she is his second wife. And Sarah married William Gardner in 1816. He is decades older than she is. And Anne and Susan eventually lived with Sarah. So we have, the sort of this family strategy, and I think this was a strategy pretty much for all of the, for people in the 18th century and 19th century, as marry as well as you can, improve your status by marriage. And then when Margaret died in 1830, she's the first of them to die. Her inventory lists a 1/4 ownership in the house next to the Manning property, known as the Purcell House. So it was the Wentworth House had become known as the Purcell House. And the remaining sisters advertised that the house is for rent, a convenient house in good repair, formerly occupied by the Mrs. Purcell near the mansion of Captain Manning. So this is in 1830. We have generic house picture there in their ad. So presumably from 1830 on, the house is rented. and they sell it out of the family to William A. Vaughan in 1835, and ends ownership by the Wentworth family. Vaughan is a painter, a house painter, and probably ship painter. And he buys the buildings and the house, land. And then after Vaughan, he ends up leaving it to basically his heirs, who are people I don't think he had children. I think he had nieces and nephews. So I kind of left it here at 8 because the question I was trying to answer is, how long did the Wentworth family own the house? And the answer is they owned it from the time it was built in the late 1690s until 1835. Do we answer the question of, was Benning Wentworth born there? The answer is still maybe. If it was built in 1695, when after Mark Hunking got the land and then provided it to his daughter and husband to build a house, Benning could have been born there in 1696, but more likely Benning wasn't born. And so we have the remaining Purcell sisters, Sarah, Anne, and Susan, living at the Wentworth, what is now called the Wentworth Gardner house, and which was a home built for their cousin, Thomas Wentworth, in 1760. So they've kind of moved up to a more modern and a grander house than their grandfather's house. And actually it was their great grandfather's house. Sarah, William Gardner died fairly soon on. And Sarah lived until 1841, Anne until 1843, and Susan 1861. Anne was nearly blind, and when she died, the obituary talks about how wonderful and charitable she was to the poor. Actually, all the Purcell sisters in their obituaries that talked about how charitable they were. But Anne was wonderful and patient, even though she was blind by the end of her life. And I guess for quite a number of years had been blind. William Gardner, at the end of his life, was blind, and Sarah had to care for him. And Susan lived there even after the house was being essentially fought over between the Gardner heirs and the Pierce family. And that's sort of another story. But it's so in tracing the people who lived in the Lieutenant Governor John Wentworth house, I've covered several of the museums, houses in Portsmouth where the people who were born or lived in the Wentworth house then lived in grander houses built by another generation. So that's the end of it, ending with the Wentworth Gardner house. So I guess we're ready for questions.
Sandra, thank you so much. That talk was thorough, and there were a lot of people, a lot of Sarahs.
I hope everyone's still awake.
Folks, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourselves and ask your question out loud.
No questions. Oh, there are some.
There was one question in the chat from John who asked, did John Wentworth own any slaves? But I think you
Did
covered
John
this.
Wentworth, Lieutenant Governor John Wentworth, own any slaves? We don't know. There aren't any in the documents, but we don't know if he did or not. I mean, the family's attitude towards slavery was clearly that they accepted that was a way of life. The family in Portsmouth was not like the part of the family that was from Barbados, but they where massive amounts of slavery happened, but the family in Portsmouth clearly accepted it. And The interesting thing is we don't think the Purcells, I mean, Gregory Purcell did own for a while a slave that had belonged to Hugh Hall Wentworth, but he basically, when he sold Hugh Hall's property off, the slave went with it, along with the pew in St. John's Church. And Sarah Purcell doesn't, neither Gregory's inventory nor Sarah Purcell's inventory includes any enslaved people. So we think that they didn't have enslaved people.
Great. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, there are some really nice comments, Sandra, in the chat, if you can see them.
Yes, I see comments in the chat. Hi, everybody.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. It was really great to see so many people here. So thank you. And thank you again, Sandra. This was wonderful.
Come and visit us.
Yes.
I will in the spring when the snow, when there's no danger of snow.
Good plan.
Yeah. I mean, we have snow here too, but it's like.
Thank you for all that great info.
Welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Bye. Take care.